Hi everyone, Daljeet Peterson here from astrolab21.com, and welcome to part 2 of the Astrology of 2020. In the first video, we took a sort of big picture perspective on the astrological factors that are contributing to what we all would consider to be this unprecedented and nearly surreal year that is 2020 so far. And we got a good perspective on why these things are occurring. And we examined the constellation of archetypal configurations that were taking place with the planets of Saturn and Pluto and then Jupiter all conjunct in the sign of Capricorn that is creating this really heavy, intense, dark energy that we all seem to be processing right now. But in this video, I wanted to pivot and take another lens on these astrological configurations. And rather than focus on the big picture and the collective impact, I want to pivot and focus on how these archetypal characteristics are affecting us on an individual basis. Because in a lot of ways, that's when the real work with these archetypes is done. Because just as all of these archetypal complexes are playing out on the national and world stage in the events unfolding, they're also affecting each one of us individually. And if we can take a look at these perspectives and see how we can each use the energy and the opportunity that's being presented to us. And I know it's hard to see this as an opportunity, but really that's what it is. There is this sort of, and that's why astrology is so powerful, because it really is revealing the deeper truth of what's unfolding here, that there is likely indeed a silver lining to all of this if we can all collectively, individually, and as a collective, rise up to meet the challenge of the times that we're living through. So once again, we'll use these graphic illustrations to help us kind of wrap our brains around these archetypal complexes, because I know often it can seem confusing. There's a lot of characteristics and qualities that each of the archetypes seems to possess. Oftentimes they seem contradictory, and that's because there's a light and a dark, and we're being called to express either or. There's free will. There's no determinism that because Pluto and Saturn are conjunct in Capricorn that this will happen. We will have authoritative transformational process and the systems will all fail. You know, there's nothing that says this shall be. We all have the free will to choose which aspect of that archetype that we want to engage with energetically and sort of evolutionarily. So we'll take a look at some of these graphics. I want to start with the two planetary archetypes of Saturn and Pluto, the heavies as I call them here. And you know, they've earned that reputation for good reason, because they both represent functions in life that are heavy lifts. They force us to really have to dig deep and buck up and do the hard work of personal growth and evolution in life. So with Saturn, we've all been experiencing some of its challenging aspects with the quarantine and shelter in place and social distancing. I think a lot of us have had our fill of restrictions and isolations and contraction. It's feeling really oppressive, and it's been a real challenge. But it's also an opportunity. And I've seen a lot of people take this opportunity to do what I think the real calling of Saturn is. What it's challenging us to do in 2020 is to restructure, rebuild and restructure our lives in a way that is more productive. Reevaluate what is of value to us, what is of real value. Reevaluate our work lives. What is important about the work we do? Are we doing the work that we are called to do? What is the role in society that we want to play? Are we fulfilling that role? Are we living up to our highest potential? Sometimes these limitations can be actually necessary because they force us to reevaluate our situation and make the necessary adjustments to foster our personal growth. So Saturn is really calling us to get our personal houses in order so that we can have the strength and determination to rise and meet the challenges that we are being presented with at this time, individually and collectively. And if we look at the Pluto side of the equation, I think what Pluto is calling us to do this year is to really face our own demons and confront the shadow. I think we're seeing this playing out in the collective right now, and it's also clearly working its way through all of us as individuals. And it's that shadow part that we don't want to recognize or acknowledge. What we're seeing is a lot of this plutonic energy that is usually kept suppressed. It's kept unconscious, it's pushed down, but it's just forcing its way up from that subterranean depth and really forcing us to look at and examine our collective and individual shadows. What is it that we're hiding? What are we afraid of? Do the shadow work. Look at what's unconscious. What are we not owning in ourselves? What are we compulsively addicted to? Is it food? Is it sex? Is it drugs? Is it alcohol? Is it attention? Is it social media? What is it that wants to be eliminated, and what can we release? What can we let go of? How can we transform ourselves so that we can be reborn into a higher state of being? So you might be saying to yourself, all right, enough already with the heavies and the darkness and the shadow work and the hard work and determination. And so let's pivot now to a little bit more optimistic perspective. And that's what we get from bringing Jupiter into the picture. Now, in many ways, I think Jupiter is offering us an antidote to the heavy darkness that we've been feeling over the last few months. It is associated with a sense of optimism, of hope, of higher purpose and inspiration. And I think that's something that we all need to tap into right now as a way of buoying ourselves in these challenging times. Now we can see that two of the important characteristics associated with Jupiter are knowledge and wisdom. And of course, we are turning to our experts and our leaders to help guide us through these challenging times. But we also have to understand that we need to look for that knowledge and wisdom within ourselves. We need to be our own best teacher and mentor. We need to seek our own truths and help make sense of the world for ourselves and for those around us. Jupiter can give us that think globally, act locally type of mentality. And that could be something that's really needed at this time. But again, there's two sides to the coin, as with every archetype. There's also the chance that we can express some of the negative sides of Jupiter, which is that over-exuberance, the excessiveness and indulgence. If we look at what happened on the national stage with the urgency to reopen the economies too soon, there was an overly optimistic opinion that the worst was over and that we could move on with our lives. And that's what happened when Jupiter was coming through with Pluto. And that proved to be problematic. And so we can see how the negative side of Jupiter can play out in this configuration. So the question is, if it expands on some of the negative or shadow sides of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction with its heavy, dark, unconscious energy, then we're expressing the shadow side of all three of these planetary archetypes, then we're likely to have a pretty bumpy ride for the next couple of years. But if we can find a way to embrace the more proactive side of Jupiter, we have multiple opportunities to tap into Jupiter's optimism and hope and uplifting spirit, and maybe have a little sense of humor. I think it's something that's been sort of lacking in our lives. The gravity and severity of the situation, both with the pandemic and with the social justice issues and cancel culture. There's not a lot of levity and humor around these days, and I think we could use a little more of that. But the other thing that's important about Jupiter is its emphasis on the future. Jupiter is very future oriented. It's all about what's next and where we're going. And I think that's a key component to this configuration that we're experiencing in this crazy year of 2020. It seems that it's the end of an era, that an old way is dying and a new one is being born. And when I say that, I'm reminded of a quote from a great book called Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. It's probably one of the most important books on astrology that's been written in the last 20 years. And I'm going to read you a quote about the Saturn-Pluto cycle. Tarnas writes, "The alignments of the Saturn-Pluto cycle coincide with especially challenging historical periods marked by a pervasive quality of intense contraction, eras of international crisis and conflict, empowerment of reactionary forces and totalitarian impulses, organized violence and oppression, all sometimes marked by lasting traumatic effects. An atmosphere of gravity and tension tended to accompany these 3 to 4 year periods, as did widespread sense of epochal closure, the end of an era, the end of innocence, the destruction of an earlier mode of life that in retrospect may seem to have been marked by widespread indulgence, decadence, naivete, denial, and inflation." So that quote seems very appropriate to the time that we're living through today. There's this deep and profound sense that we are experiencing the end of an era, and that a new era is being born right before our very eyes. And that metaphor also applies to each of us as individuals. We're all being called to reform and restructure our old ways of being. What new versions of ourselves is ready to be born at this time? If we can do that as individuals, then collectively we can affect the kind of change we want to see in the world. And I think if we look at this constellation of these 3 planetary archetypes that are so prevalent in this year of 2020, if there's one meta message that we can distill from all of this, that could be it. That we are birthing the future. And perhaps some of what we're experiencing with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction are the birth pains of the new era. But like childbirth, it's something that we must endure because the result is amazing. The result is new life, the continuation of the species. So that could be an apt metaphor for the entirety of 2020. Surviving the birth canal and coming out the other end reborn. And I know that sounds like a quasi-spiritual notion, but that really is what Jupiter is offering us at this time. It's what it's contributing to this constellation that is going to accelerate and expand the potential for the great transformational possibilities that Pluto has on offer, and for the ability to restructure society that the Saturn configuration is bringing to the table. So if we can really harness all of these 3 archetypes in the most positive way, then the opportunity is tremendous. But if we have a tendency to move towards the shadow side of these archetypes, then the potential is just disastrous. Free will choice. What are we going to do? How are we going to navigate these unprecedented times that we're living through? So a lot to digest in this episode, a lot of big ideas floating around at this time. And this is the time for big ideas. This is the time for big changes. This happens in every society, in every civilization. And civilizations come and go, right? We've seen it throughout history. And when they fail to meet these big challenges, they crumble, they deteriorate, right? The Egyptians, the Romans, the British Empire, right? They were once the world dominant hegemony, and now it's the American century. Now, is the American century about to end? I don't know. I guess it's up to Americans to determine that. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope there's some real, genuine insight to be gleaned from examining this year of 2020 from the perspective of this powerful configuration that we're experiencing, this rich constellation of archetypes that is really calling us all to live our best lives, to step up and become the best version of ourselves. And if we can do that as individuals, within our families, within our relationships, within our communities, that can spread throughout all of society and can have a profound effect on the future that we are all currently creating together. So I hope you can find some inspiration in that. I hope you can find some optimism and a reason to be hopeful as we move through the rest of 2020 and beyond. I will do some more videos on some of the configurations that are coming up for us in the second half of 2020. So I hope you can join me as we continue to examine from this archetypal perspective and help make sense of the world that is 2020. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.